At the end of January 2021, The Last of Us Part 2 dethroned The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt as the most awarded video game in history. Controversial in the eyes of some, but undeniable to all, Naughty Dog's long-awaited sequel continues to fill its post-apocalyptic mantelpiece with accolade after accolade, toting more trophies than Drive Club and Rise of the Tomb Raider combined. Winning everything from Game of the Year and Best Visual Design to Best Original Soundtrack and Best Performance, it sits amongst the very elite of the video game pantheon, with the likes of Red Dead Redemption 2, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and Skyrim. On the anniversary of its release, I wanted to dig a little deeper, not into its gameplay or graphics, but into what makes the story of The Last of Us Part 2 so utterly enduring and remarkable. Storytelling as a medium of entertainment is as old as mankind, and with such a deep-rooted adoration for stories, it's hardly surprising that a video game based on a series of books, The Witcher 3, was so unanimously well loved and received by critics and players alike. Boasting all of the brilliance and depth we'd expect from a novel, but in a medium through which we can experience Geralt's wild hunts firsthand, The Witcher stole the show despite stiff competition from the likes of Fallout 4, Bloodborne, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, and Her Story. For 5 years, CD Projekt Red's seminal fantasy extravaganza sat pretty at the very pinnacle of video game glory. That is, until the tragic tale of two lives torn apart by love and vengeance came mushrooming into our hearts and living rooms. Enter The Last of Us Part 2. And though The Last of Us isn't based on a book, it employs a whole host of narrative techniques and storytelling tropes that set it apart from your standard video game outing. From subtle parallels between opposing characters to frankly inspired symbolism, let's tighten up our gas masks, take a deep breath, and enter the stormy city of Seattle once more as we unpack 3 key components within the biology of this tremendous beast. It's a shame umbrellas didn't survive the global apocalypse, because a colossal black rain cloud casts a sinister shadow over Ellie and Abby's days in Seattle. And from the flooded city streets to the terrifying waves of the surrounding sea, water plays an enormous role in The Last of Us Part 2. On the surface, the approaching storm seems simply to act as further emphasis of our characters' innermost turmoil, an outward representation of the emotional state Ellie and Abby find themselves in. In art and literature, this is known as pathetic fallacy. The weather is personified, or given the characteristics and feelings of the characters within the story. And, as the storm only gets more and more intense as the game draws to its heart-thumping climax, it's a safe bet that this was a conscious choice from Naughty Dog. But with so much water elsewhere in the game too, from Owen's Haven at the aquarium to the hellish end-of-the-world seashore that hosts Abby and Ellie's final face-off, there seems to be more to the game's use of water than initially meets Tommy's one remaining eye. Diving a little deeper, the water seems to act as a motif, a recurring component within the narrative that holds symbolic importance and conveys a sense of something. But what is it representing here? Going back to the beginning of our story, the water is frozen solid in sheets of ice and snow that surround Jackson. But as Ellie's fixation on finding Joel's killer begins to boil and lead her to Seattle, we see the beginnings of the storm brewing in parallel. In the Road to the Aquarium chapter, as Ellie splits from Jesse, and we see the first true signs of her grave obsession with finding Abby, the storm intensifies all around. Then, in the flooded city, the waterways that lead Ellie to the aquarium are some of the most menacing and dangerous that we see, even capsizing her boat as she nears her destination. Putting these two progressions side by side, it would appear that the water in the game represents our character's rage, fury, and yearning for vengeance. For Abby, the same progression applies. In her numerous flashbacks, we see Owen offer her a safe haven where water is literally contained and held at bay behind glass dividers. Owen presents Abby with a look at what the world could be like if she'd just leave her vengeful vow behind her. But no amount of decoration or distraction will do. her fixation ultimately wins out. Then, in the main timeline, the first rainfall comes as Abby is captured by the Seraphites, a cult she violently despises. As Abby loses more and more of her loved ones, the storm strengthens, mirroring the ferocity of her rage. Finally, as Abby discovers Ellie's hideout in the abandoned theatre on day 3, the rain is unrelenting, just like her lust for blood. How fitting then that the game's harrowing crescendo takes place in the sea itself. But here, with both Ellie and Abby bereft of all energy, rage and conviction for killing one another, the waters are calmer and less violent. As Ellie reluctantly holds Abby's head below water, it is a perfect meeting of the literal and metaphorical. The water that has represented our protagonist's rage throughout the game is now the thing that threatens to put an end to Abby's life. It's actually kind of beautiful, if you can look past all the brutality. For anyone out there that can't look past Abby's enviable golfing skills to understand her suffering and plight, this next consideration might sting a little. Joel and Abby are, in many ways, mirror images of one another, both as characters and in their plot progressions. Let's put away the 9-iron and take a closer look at everyone's favourite and potentially least favourite characters in The Last of Us series. The Last of Us Part 1 begins in heartbreak, with Joel cradling his dying daughter Sarah in his arms. Then, throughout the game's story, we see Joel form a father-daughter bond with Ellie, a second chance at a family of his own. Putting aside the morally ambiguous conclusion to their journey, the game's story ends more happily for Joel than it began. He protects Ellie in a way he couldn't with Sarah. And yet, when we hold up the mirror, the cost of saving Ellie was, aside from potentially dooming the entire future of the human race, the murder of Abby's father, Jerry. Abby's story, as it pertains to The Last of Us Part 2 then, also begins with tragedy and the loss of a loved one. So far, so similar. But the parallels don't end with death being the catalyst for each story's beginning. Throughout the journey we take with Joel and Ellie in the original Last of Us game, Ellie is an orphaned teenager who stands opposed to the societal and expected norms within the game's world, her sexual preference for other girls, anti-authority attitude and, of course, immunity to the cordyceps infection. As the pair grow closer, Ellie begins to soften Joel's demeanour and outlook, turning him from a self-interested and ruthless smuggler in Part 1 of the series to a loving and compassionate father figure by Part 2. For him, Ellie represents hope in an otherwise hopeless world, reminding him there is still something worth living for. Much like Joel, when Abby meets Lev in The Last of Us Part 2, she is filled with rage and more alone than any time before. Her blinkered fixation on avenging her father's death led her to lose the man she loved in Owen, leaving her with little more than her skills as a soldier to another's cause. She exists solely to serve the Washington Liberation Front, much as Joel existed to serve the Fireflies. And, much like Ellie, Lev doesn't conform to his society's norms or traditions either. He defies his assignment to be married to an elder, shaves his head, and follows his own gender identity, despite all of these actions opposing the Seraphites' practices. Lev also ends up without a family after the death of both his mother and sister Yara, leaving him orphaned and alone. As one final moment of parity, Abby turns on her wolf comrades to protect Lev, just as Joel turned on the Fireflies during the events of St. Mary's Hospital. The use of mirroring like this is a classic way to highlight the differences in two characters, whilst at the same time emphasising both the positives and negatives of the other. As such, Abby and Joel are each other's equal, and each other's foil. A character used to put a protagonist's motives and traits in context through comparison. Arguably, it is their uncanny similarities as characters that act as the wake-up call which stops Ellie from drowning Abby during Part 2's conclusion, a plot point hinted at by the brief flashback we see of Joel playing guitar on the porch. This of course begs the question, if we had followed Abby's story rather than Joel's before the events of The Last of Us Part 2, would the controversy felt towards Abby now instead be aimed at Joel for killing Jerry? For a game mostly devoid of wildlife, except for that boar in Wyoming's abandoned museum, stupid piece of shit, There are a lot of references to, and depictions of, animals and insects scattered all about The Last of Us Part 2. Looking just to the numerous factions that sprawl the infected wastelands, there's Fireflies, Wolves, Rattlers, and a brief reference from Dina to a group she calls the Ravens. Given the level of thought and detail that has gone into crafting the game's narrative, the choice to give these factions names tied to the animal kingdom seems anything but random. So what does it all mean? The very first group the games greet us with are the Fireflies, a rebel group bent on overthrowing the oppressive Fedra soldiers and their tyrannical reign. Probably the easiest to unpick, a Firefly typically lights up the darkness, a simple bit of symbolism to portray the sense that this faction are wanting to bring hope back to the world amidst the dark times in which they now live. In the first game, this hope takes the form of Ellie, a literal cure for the plague that ravages the landscape. Once that hope is ripped away from them during the heart-stopping conclusion to the game, we are presented with a world devoid of Fireflies just 5 years later in The Last of Us Part 2. This neatly continues the symbolic positioning of the group. Now there is seemingly no cure for the cordyceps infection, the light in the dark fades almost to nothingness. Many of the characters we meet along the way in The Last of Us were once associated with the Fireflies, including many members of the WLF that we meet in The Last of Us Part 2. Abby, Owen, Nora and Manny are all notable Firefly alumni, and all of them now don the moniker of the Wolf. Having lost all hope, as symbolised by the Firefly title, these four friends found themselves wandering hopelessly in the metaphoric darkness of post-apocalyptic America. That is, until they found themselves a new pack to roam with. A wolf, as a typically nocturnal creature, is the perfect symbol for a group who have accepted the dark fate of the world and now find strength in numbers. Travelling in packs across the American wastelands, the wolves' predatory operating methods befit their title, torturing and slaughtering any who pose a threat to their group. Wolves are also known for their pack mentality, willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater safety of the family unit, a behaviour we see take full effect in the Seraphite Island siege later in the game. And it is in this war against the Seraphites we find an even deeper symbolism for the name wolf. In many Western religions, a wolf is representative of the devil, a creature sent as an agent of Satan. Looking to the name of their opposing cult, the Seraphites, the term seraph refers to a kind of angel, which metaphorically sets up these warring factions as devils battling with angels, a beautiful and subtle use of folklore and symbolism. Of course, to say either side of this conflict are the good guys would be to misunderstand the entire game's commentary on the idea that what is right and wrong is very much subjective and determined by which side you're pulling for. But nonetheless, it is hard to deny the brilliant juxtaposition of these two factions who eventually end up destroying one another. Lastly, as we move away from the game's many factions, there is one other creature that is centre stage for much of The Last of Us Part 2 that goes quietly unnoticed. You can spot some on Ellie's arm, in her notebook, on the fretboard of Joel's guitar, and even on the loading screen. Moths are a key symbol within the game, but what do they represent for Ellie and the wider narrative? Moths are drawn obsessively towards the light, no matter the consequence. Given that the game draws a connection between Ellie and the moth, we can understand that this is representative of Ellie's fixation on pursuing her revenge, regardless of what it will cost her. She loses friends, loved ones, and eventually literal parts of herself to this unrelenting hunt for revenge, which makes the moth a perfect symbol for Ellie's journey. This moth-like mentality is arguably just as dangerous to Ellie as the spores are to the rest of the world around her, which is why replacing the spores that appear on the first game's loading screen with moths in the second is a little touch of genius. Whether you loved or hated this bold and heartbreaking sequel, The Last of Us Part 2's storytelling brilliance is incontestable. We've barely scratched the surface here today, but hopefully this closer look into some of the game's cleverly crafted layers has heightened your admiration for one of this generation's most important video game sagas. Bring on The Last of Us Part 3. It's time to leave Seattle behind once more, but I hope you've enjoyed dipping your toes back into the flooded streets of Ellie and Abby's epic tale. Did you spot anything else noteworthy within the nooks and crannies of The Last of Us Part 2? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're there, make like the infected and clicker the like and subscribe buttons. I can't promise there won't be more terrible puns like that, but I can promise more delicious content very soon. I've been Adam at Glitchqraft, and... Oh god. Time to go.